At 7:45 a.m. on December 19, 1944, the Ardennes forest wasn't just a battlefield. It was a frozen white slaughterhouse. 20 kilometers west of St. Vith, Belgium, at a critical junction known as Point 210, Sergeant Frank "Tank" Kowalski, 24 years old, of the U.S. 32nd Armored Regiment, stood inside hell. His M4 Sherman, affectionately nicknamed Vagabond, was a 30-ton monster cloaked in ice and soot, completely still. It had stopped moving exactly 18 minutes ago. The air inside the engine compartment reeked of unburned fuel and despair. Outside, the temperature had dropped to a shocking -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius overnight. That morning, the cold seemed to cut through steel itself, joined by the ominous roar of approaching German heavy artillery. Kowalski didn't need binoculars to know how exposed they were. Vagabond was isolated, just 300 meters from a dense tree line spitting out black smoke. German artillery flashes, and in minutes, tanks from the 2nd Panzer Division would storm through. The main American defensive line was over a kilometer back. If Kowalski and his crew couldn't restart the Sherman in under 120 seconds, they'd be burning metal. And the reason for the failure wasn't an 88mm shell or a teller mine. It was far more trivial, and to Kowalski, more humiliating. The fuel had frozen. Not solid like ice, but the extreme cold had turned their low-octane aviation gasoline, the kind they'd been rationing, into thick, sludgy jelly. It clogged the primary fuel line feeding the V8 engine. To understand why this mechanical failure was more dangerous than an infantry assault, you need to understand who Sergeant Kowalski was, and why his unit was dismissed by command, but feared by the enemy. Kowalski and his men weren't glorified infantry who happened to drive tanks. They were survival engineers. His unit, Company D, known as the Garage Mechanics, was a collection of unemployed mechanics, New York electricians, and former garage owners from Detroit. Men drafted not for tactical brilliance, but for their ability to make a 1937 Chevy engine run on kerosene and spit. In the Standard Army, maintenance followed a strict manual. If a tank was too damaged for basic field repair, it was marked Code Red and sent to the rear, often taking weeks to return. But Company D didn't follow the manual. Their commander, Captain Elias Thorne, was a peculiar idealist who had fought to keep his undesirables out of military prison. Thorne saw what high command ignored. Survival on the battlefield was, 80% of the time, about improvised engineering. While other platoons lost tanks to blown tires or broken oil lines, Company D specialized in stealing parts, converting gasoline engines for diesel operations, and crucially, in keeping morale alive even when their Sherman was falling apart. They were notorious for using barbed wire, grenade shrapnel, and even stolen civilian car parts to patch tanks overnight, ready to fight by morning. This obsession with keeping things running, no matter the tactical or logistical cost, became their identity. When the Ardennes offensive erupted, Hitler's last massive counterattack, Company D was posted at the most vulnerable sector, with no proper equipment for the Siberian winter that had settled over Western Europe. The fight against the Panzers was fierce, but the fight against the cold never stopped. Steel freezes, oil thickens, batteries die in minutes. German engineering was prepared. Their vehicles came with heaters and cold-resistant fuels. The Americans, reliant on sea supply and summer logistics, were not. And now, Kowalski was facing the price of that lack of preparation. The radio crackled. "Vagabond, this is Eagle. What's your status? We need cover at 210. Repeat, we need it now." Private Billy Price, the young radio operator, spoke through clenched fear. "Sergeant, they're moving out of the trees. 3 Panzers, long barrels." "I swear it." Long barrels meant Panzer IV SFJ, or worse, the dreaded Stu G3. Either could punch through a Sherman like wet paper. 3 enemy tanks, 300 meters. 30 seconds to firing range. Kowalski glanced at the fuel gauge. Enough to drive 50 miles, if it were liquid. But it wasn't. Desperate attempts to start the engine yielded nothing but a faint, sad whine from the starter. The manual said, "Abandon the vehicle, pull the ignition, fall back on foot. Avoid death or capture." But Kowalski knew better. If they left the Vagabond, the 3 Shermans behind them would lose their only cover at the junction. Thousands of lives depended on that blockage. He needed heat, and fast, to liquefy the fuel in the line. But heat was a luxury. Open flame inside a gasoline tank, suicide. Then his gunner, Staff Sergeant Dave Diesel Miller, a burly former plumber from Chicago, had an idea. It was insane, against every rule of safety and military protocol. But in the white hell of Ardennes, it was the only way out. "Sergeant," Miller said, strangely calm, "I've got a hack. A stupid one. But it might give us 5 minutes of engine." Kowalski didn't flinch. Fear had melted into pure adrenaline. "Speak, Miller. Anything." Miller pointed to the emergency kits stashed under their seats. "We've got the internal heater, Sergeant. And the rations." He meant the bean soup, instant coffee, and more importantly, the tiny water heaters used for warming coffee. These weren't meant for engines, just survival. "We're going to use the coffee, Sergeant, but not for drinking." Kowalski nodded. A plan unfolded in his head. This was survival engineering in its rawest form. The risk of explosion was huge, but the alternative was certain death. The countdown to mechanical failure had just fused with the countdown to annihilation. Company D was about to pull off the most desperate, reckless, and ridiculous repair job in the European theater. And they had under a minute to do it. 8:02 a.m. The Vagabond burst out of the tree line like a frozen phantom. Sergeant Kowalski didn't give the Panzers a chance to adjust. His plan was simple and dangerous. Don't trade shots head-on, but create immediate tactical chaos. "Miller, first tank on the left. He round, aim for the tracks." Miller quickly adjusted the sights. The Sherman's 75mm cannon was inferior in penetration to the long 75mm of the Panzer IVs, but a high-explosive shell was devastating against unarmored components like suspension systems and tracks. Boom! The He round hit the lead Panzer's tread with surgical precision. It didn't pierce the side armor, but the blast tore multiple track links and crushed one of the suspension wheels. The tank spun uncontrollably, snow and frozen dirt flying. Richter, the German commander of the lead Panzer, was furious. He had expected a cautious retreat. Instead, he got a lunatic in a lone Sherman. 8:03 a.m. The other 2 Panzers began rotating their turrets toward Vagabond. Kowalski couldn't stay still. A stationary tank is a dead tank. He leveraged the Sherman's superior maneuverability. Reverse 50 meters. Reload. The engine, barely sustained by their jury-rigged coffee heater hack, coughed but stayed running. A second Panzer fired an armor-piercing shell. Kowalski spun the Sherman at the last second. The shell tore through where the turret had been moments earlier, hitting a log pile. Miller, with loader Jack Sparky Daniels beside him, shouted, "AP round." Second tank, side shot, now. Vagabond skidded to a halt. The turret turned. They fired. Clang, a direct hit. The round didn't penetrate completely, but knocked off the Sherman side armor and rattled the crew. The second Panzer was still moving. Then, Krakum. A shot slammed into Vagabond's turret edge. It ricocheted, no full penetration, but the blow was brutal. Interior lights blinked out. The air filled with scorched metal. "Damage. Report," shouted Kowalski, wiping blood from his nose. "No penetration, Sarge. External fire on the turret." Price called back. Flames danced on the hull. They had to act fast. "Miller, smoke grenade. We need cover to reposition." The shell exploded. releasing a dense gray fog over the crossroads. 8:05 a.m. That smoke bought seconds. Kowalski used it to reposition to a 45-degree flanking angle. Richter, now fully aware that this Sherman wasn't ordinary, gave frantic orders. Kowalski halted behind a slight hill. They're still blind in the smoke. 15 seconds. Miller, AP round. Aim for the turret on the damaged one. Miller aimed. The electric hum of the field heater, stolen wire keeping the fuel warm, vibrated faintly beneath the tension. They fired. Flash. A flash. Direct hit on the turret ring of the 2nd Panzer. Smoke poured out. It was out of the fight. Now just 2 remained. The immobilized, but still armed lead Panzer, and the 3rd one advancing. And Vagabond was nearly out of AP rounds. Then hope. Price's radio came to life. Vagabond, this is Fury. 300 yards out. We're almost there. Kowalski had bought 5 precious minutes. But the final round and the final gamble were still ahead. 8 a.m. The Vagabond was in trouble. The smoke had started to clear, revealing the terrifying scene. The immobilized Panzer IV, still deadly with its 75mm gun, was aiming directly at the Sherman's turret. And to the left, the 3rd Panzer IV, fully operational, had just entered the main road. Miller, last AP round. Make it count, Kowalski said, his voice tense but steady. Fury and Piston, their 2 backup Shermans, were close, but a full minute away. Kowalski had to disable one of the 2 German tanks right now, or they'd be hit from 2 angles. He chose the most immediate threat, the immobilized Panzer. Don't aim for the center, Miller. Aim for the gun barrel, Kowalski ordered, recalling a trick Captain Thorne had once taught him. If an AP round hit the gun barrel just right, it could damage the recoil system, or, in rare cases, cause the ammo inside to detonate. Vagabond fired its final armor-piercing shell. The 75mm round didn't explode, but it struck the barrel of the lead Panzer with brutal force. The impact warped the tube. The recoil mechanism jammed. The German commander knew the tank was now useless. Richter, inside, screamed in frustration. And then, from the rear lines, Fury and Piston finally arrived. 2 fresh Shermans. 1 barely running, 2 fully armed, against 1 last German tank. Kowalski had turned a 3-1 German advantage into a 3-on-1 American counterattack. The 3rd Panzer, realizing the odds had flipped, attempted to retreat, but got caught in crossfire from Fury and Piston. It was destroyed in a hail of shells. 8:15 a.m. .210 was secure. The 2nd Panzer Division had been delayed and forced to regroup. The crucial push of the Bulge had been interrupted, giving U.S. infantry time to dig in. Vagabond limped back to the repair line. Sergeant Frank Kowalski, the Detroit mechanic turned tank commander, had won not just with firepower, but with a coffee heater and stolen wire. That day, December 19, 1944, survival engineering rewrote the course of a battle. Captain Thorne, watching the battered Vagabond return with the improvised electrical heater still wrapped around the fuel line, just shook his head and smiled. The Army would never recognize the invention. It broke every regulation. But Company D knew that heater hack had saved their lives. Frank "Tank" Kowalski survived the war and opened his own garage, where he proudly told customers he could make anything run with a gum wrapper and some wire. The Battle of the Bulge was won by countless acts of heroism, but also by thousands of acts of technical improvisation. Sometimes the difference between annihilation and victory was simply the temperature of the fuel. If you were moved by how Sergeant Kowalski and the garage mechanics used survival engineering to change the course of a battle, stick around. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We post new stories of World War II ingenuity and grit every day, and you want to miss them. Take a second now to drop a comment with your country and let us know if your family has any connection to the war. Our community is global, and together, we're keeping these stories from fading into silence. Kowalski, Miller, and all of Company D did their duty in 1944, turning scrap into salvation. Now it's our duty to remember. Like, comment, and share to keep their legacy alive. Never forget.